I do not claim that I have the answer in any way. But I do claim that she is, to me, and always will be, a pathfinder. There is no final interpretation, and that there's no final version. And I love that. I think that's thrilling.
I feel as if I've been reading her all my life. She was one of my father's favorite poets, and I remember his voice reading her work to me when I was still a very young child, and I remember the quiet of those moments. There was something in Dickinson that summoned him, an awareness, I think I could say, of something right beside us, something palpable but not quite visible, a presence maybe, or a force, or the trace of one. The materiality of the letter, it's light, but not as light as air. It has weight and a body. It carries the hand that wrote it, is part of its beauty. If it arrives, it can be held.
I believe that every mark on paper is an acoustic mark. I think sound is the most important thing in poetry. Sound is crucial for a poem.
There is a spareness to Dickinson's lyric, but this does not preclude her capacity to immerse us in an experience of extraordinary plenitude. Always, always we are reminded of her slant nearness to beings and things. Strange, bright crowds of flowers, bees by the furlong, firmamental seas, mountains that grow unnoticed, the stones a chase.
Well, years ago, I wrote a book called My Emily Dickinson, and it was centered around a well-known poem of hers called, it isn't called because she didn't title her poems, excuse me, but the first line was, "My life had stood a loaded gun."
Maps have never been static. To map something is not just to convey position and bearing, but also to convey movement and trajectory. And a good map does even more than this, right? It plumbs the depth, right? The texture, the tension, and the resonance in the moment of its execution and meanings.
And my concern in that book, it's a book of its period, the 80s, and I was concerned to change the scholarship, which until that time had been generally, I thought, terrible and demeaning to her. I wanted to emphasize the fact of her immense intellectual curiosity and how much she had read and how she used what she read in her writing.
In the 19th century, the advent of an early form of infographics encouraged the creation of new kinds of maps capable of fusing thousands of pieces of data into one picture, showing, as the naturalist and mapmaker Alexander von Humboldt said, the simultaneous action and connecting links of the forces which pervade the universe. This may be exaggerating the case a little, but still, among the maps in a vast atlas of Dickinson's work and world, we might find maps representing the deep past of that corner of the world in which she lived, as the geologists and old earth creationists of her time would have understood it, overlaid with newer accounts of that billion-year history of continental collisions and drift, volcanic arcs, and multiple ice ages.
As a poet myself, I can't be just called a poet. I always have to be called an experimental poet or difficult poet or innovative poet. To me, all good poetry is experimental in some way. And I would assume that my approach to Emily Dickinson would be considered experimental.
Too, we might find maps charting the topographic features of the planet's surface, the region's fauna and flora, its weather and soundscape. The distant links between this lost earth and Dickinson's work are evoked in Higginson's description of Dickinson's handwriting as resembling the fossil tracks of prehistoric birds found by Amherst professor Edward Hitchcock in the bedrock and preserved by the glacial ice.
Well, I think that the whole legend, the whole thing about Emily Dickinson is highly neurotic, never married, some had agoraphobia or terrible love affair. To be that kind of poet, you have to shut yourself away. I mean, if you want to produce that much work, that's your calling. That's your calling. I mean, Wallace Stevens was like that too in his strain. I mean, he went to the office, but no one ever crossed the door of his house. I think that she feels that she found that she had a calling. It was at a time of huge religious conversions, and she refused to convert. But I believe she did have a conversion experience, which was to accept the calling, which was this immense talent.
The maps of Dickinson's exterior world are still few in comparison to the maps of her interior world, or worlds. How does she care for her own archives? How does she keep order among the hundreds of documents accumulating around her? In our accounting of Dickinson's countless hours, no question feels final. What lay open on the cherry table on that day in April 1862, when she first wrote to Thomas Wentworth Higginson to ask him if her poems breathed? What rested on her desk on 15 May 1886, the day when her breath stopped forever? And what was there the day after her death? And how and when was the desk at last cleared of its unruly contents, turned back into an empty signifier, an empty point of reference?
The embers of 1,000 years uncovered by the hand, and then you turn it over. I mean, I just love this thing. That fondled them when they were fire will gleam and understand. And the word stir up there. I mean, my God, it's incredible to me. It's a piece of fire.
I must say that I'm given pause by the work of archaeologists. Archaeologists, right, whose awareness of our losses may be as pronounced as the poets, have estimated that at least 95% of all the artwork ever created on the earth has vanished or been destroyed. When we think about the unlikely odds that Dickinson's work survives for us to read on a planet that has been spinning around the sun for 4.54 billion years, we might give ourselves up to astonishment.
I'm Susan Howe, and I'm a poet, but I've also written some literary criticism of a kind that really is very poetic-based. I would consider myself a poet scholar.
I'm Marta Werner, and I'm a professor of English at Dewaville College in Buffalo, New York. And I have written on Dickinson for the last 20 years.